Remember, we always have a choice. The Austrian World Summit is about solutions, about presenting what is already possible. Let's choose sustainable housing. The Austrian building company Suba, part of Haumann Enterprise, is on the forefront of creating sustainable and carbon-neutral buildings. Affordable housing in climate-friendly and energy-efficient buildings. Let's choose For Forest, the voice for trees. It all began with a drawing. Now, For Forest once again is starting an exciting project. The For Forest Innovation Park, a new home for green technologies. Let's choose EcoAlf, upcycling the oceans, transforming marine debris into top-quality yarn. Let's choose Soulmate, the photovoltaic system for the balcony. Let's choose Vienna Solar Power Initiative. Vienna's progressive coalition has set itself the goal of making Vienna climate neutral by 2040. Attracting attention and creating solutions to challenge the climate crisis. Climate action stories, the power of the right choice.
Let me just say thank you to Governor Schwarzenegger and also to Lisa Jackson. You could not have given us a better setup for our high-level panel because it's all about leadership and it's all about solutions. And ladies and gentlemen, those inspiring projects and climate action stories that we saw in the film, they definitely are making a difference. And yet, we have to move faster. And the fact is, we can move faster. The technology that we need, much of it is there. It's proven. We know what policies work, and we've got a lot of green capital just waiting to be unleashed. So if we're serious about respecting planetary boundaries and really working on the interlinked crises that our planet faces, then we simply need to apply these powerful levers. And that is what this panel is all about. We want to talk very concretely about actions, about solutions. And joining me is an outstanding roster of speakers to do just that, some with us virtually, some with me right here live at the Hofburg, which is a wonderful change after the past 18 months. It is my pleasure to introduce here with me Alok Sharma, British MP and also president of this year's United Nations Climate Conference, and we were told to avoid acronyms. I'm not going to say COP. I'll just point out that this is the 26th session of this conference that aims to bring together all the countries of the world to talk about how they boost meaningful climate action. Great that you can join us here live at the Hofburg. Also with us is the president of Latvia, Egils Levits. Wonderful that you can be with here as well. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm very pleased to introduce also President Walva Ramkalawan of the Seychelles. So grateful that you could make this journey. And to all of our virtual speakers, a very warm welcome as well. I will introduce you one by one shortly. I think your faces are undoubtedly familiar to just about everybody in the audience. But I'd like to begin, first of all, with a very esteemed returning guest who joins us virtually this time around. She has been at the forefront of the conservation movement for decades. And she says the challenge that we face now is as urgent as it ever has been. It is a great pleasure to welcome the science pioneer, the UN messenger of peace, Jane Goodall. And dear Jane Goodall, thank you so much for joining us again. Great to have you. As I mentioned, you say the challenge has never been so urgent. So please tell us your point of view as a scientist. How sick is the planet?
Well, unfortunately, I think the planet is very, very sick indeed. And everybody listening knows that, knows how we have polluted the air and the land and the water. And the loss of biodiversity, climate change, all of these things mean that we are living on a very, very sick planet. The environment is sick, and humans are sick too. And we've compromised those two great lungs of the world that absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, and that's our oceans that we've so badly polluted. They can't do their job properly anymore in many places, and our forests. And the forests include the kelp forests of the ocean. And everywhere we've been destroying forests so that we've lost an enormous amount of biodiversity as well. Because particularly the rainforests, they are great sources of rich biodiversity. And I learned when I was in the rainforests of Tanzania studying the chimpanzees, how every little species has a role to play in this great tapestry of life, the biodiversity of an area. And it may seem unimportant if one small species vanishes, but maybe it was the main food source of another, which was the main food source of another, and so on. So if you see this as a tapestry, every time a species of plant or animal goes extinct, it's like pulling a thread from that tapestry. And if enough threads are pulled, the tapestry hangs in tatters and the ecosystem will collapse. And this has happened. And so we still have a window of time when we can do something about this, but the window is closing and we need to act now.
Let me ask you, because this is a message you actually have been delivering for decades, this message about the fragility of the ecosystem and the fact that people, planet, and wildlife are absolutely interlinked with one another. Do you have the impression that the pandemic has finally gotten that message across? Are you hopeful that this year could represent a turning point when we really do begin to work toward healing the planet?
Well, I certainly hope so, because if we don't, then that's not very good outlook for future generations. In fact, a very grim and bleak outlook. But the pandemic has certainly raised awareness. And for one thing, more people understand that the pandemic, just like climate change and loss of biodiversity, is our fault because it's our fault because we have so disrespected animals and the environment. That led to conditions, animals pushed in closer contact with people, being sold for food and medicine and as exotic pets in wildlife markets. Animals, domestic animals, crowded together in these horrible and unhygienic factory farms all around the world. These create situations where a pathogen like the COVID-19 virus can hop from an animal to a person. And the scientists have been warning us for years that this sort of pandemic was inevitable. And if we don't change, then more pandemics will arise. So um, this pandemic has raised awareness of the fact that we truly do need to start finding ways of living in harmony with nature and stop disrespecting nature, because we depend, as I've said, on nature, but we depend on healthy ecosystems, and that's what we're destroying. So more people are talking about what's going wrong. That's what this conference is all about. And I really wish I was with you in person, because it's so much easier talking to people. But more and more people, countries, businesses, and I heard Lisa Jackson talking about Apple, are truly beginning to think about ways of living in greater harmony with the planet. And it's unfortunate that some politicians, some business leaders can't wait to get back to business as usual. And this crazy idea, which people are either stupid or they just want to ignore, we cannot have unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources, which already in some places are being used up faster than nature can replenish them, and growing populations of human and livestock. That cannot be. And yet some people want to carry on, as I say, with business as usual, putting the GDP above protecting the environment for the future. And so I don't want to end up sounding too gloomy. We are in a very bad state, and I repeat that because there's an urgency about this. And that's why it's so good to hear people talking about what companies and governments actually are doing. And there's a lot we can do. The window of time we have, I don't think is very big, but it's there. And the kind of things that we can do, which I think many people will talk about, we have to clean up the pollution of the ocean. We have to stop destroying. We have to plant, protect, and particularly protect the rainforests of the planet. We also have to reduce the unsustainable lifestyle of so many of us. Undoubtedly, many who are at this conference or listening, like myself, we have so much more than we need. On the other hand, we've got to alleviate poverty, because when you're living somewhere out in, I'm saying Africa because I know it best, but if you're living around chimpanzee habitat, the rainforest, there's such terrible poverty, lack of good health and education. And if you're really poor, you're going to cut down the last trees of those forests, not because you don't know there'll be soil erosion and the forest will turn to woodland and then to desert, but because you want more land to grow food to feed your family, or you want to cut down the trees to make charcoal to get some money. You do it because you have to. In an urban area, you buy the cheapest products. You can't afford to ask, how were they made? Did they harm the environment? You just have to buy the cheapest in order to survive. And we have to close down factory farms. We have to ban the trafficking of animals to wildlife markets. We have to ban exotic pets who carry their viruses with them. We have to move away from industrial agriculture to small-scale family farming, to permaculture, to regenerative agriculture. All of these things have been talked about, and they're happening. And nature is amazingly resilient if you give her the chance. Areas we destroyed can be brought back, and nature can flourish again. Animals on the brink of extinction can be given another chance. Governments must subsidize renewable energy and stop subsidizing the big oil and gas companies that are continuing to harm the environment. And then environmental education, education per se. And I heard Lisa talking about Apple providing software to children in developing countries. So I'm coming to the end. Just finishing. So I think environmental education in all our schools is terribly, terribly important, so that young people grow up with a new mindset to value nature and to realize that protecting the natural world is protecting our own future.
Thank you very much for that message, Jane Goodall. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have climate stories not only for all who are with us here live at the conference, but also for all of our virtual guests. So you will see these vases slowly filling up with our green scrolls, and obviously Jane Goodall's climate story will have been a long one, as will that of the man seated next to me, Alok Sharma, responsible for getting to yes at the COP26 in less than 5 months from now. Jane Goodall just mentioned that the window for climate action for the planet is limited. Certainly, the window for action on the COP is limited as well. Many scientists saying we have till the end of this decade to really get things turned around. So what's your take, looking at that deadline for November? Do you see signs that this Conference of the Parties can really set the stage for a hard break from business as usual?
Well, thank you very much. Can I just say that everyone here knows this, but in Paris at COP21, the UN climate conference, the world leaders came together and they said we would do everything we could to limit global temperature rises to less than 2 degrees, closer to 1.5 degrees. And I sincerely believe that Glasgow, where COP26 is going to be held, is our last best hope of keeping 1.5 alive. And we've had this pandemic, we've delayed the conference by a year, but climate change hasn't taken time off. Last year was the hottest year on record. The last decade was the hottest on record. And so we need to take action now. Now, I am hopeful because we have seen some moves. There's a lot of hard work to be done on the way to COP, but we now have countries representing 70% of the world economy which is committed to go to net zero carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. We've got all of the G7 countries signed up to ambitious targets to cut emissions by 2030. And in Austria, of course, you're talking about carbon neutrality in 2040. So danke Österreich. And as the governor said, ich liebe Österreich auch. But of course, it's not just commitments. We need policies as well. And one of the things I'm really pleased with is that here in Austria, you have consigned coal power to history. No more coal in your electricity mix. We're doing the same in the UK. And one of my big asks of the world is let's consign dirty coal to history. Now, in terms of what we can do going forward, this is a chance for us out of the pandemic to reimagine our economies. You know, green growth is possible. We've shown that in the UK. Last 30 years, we've grown our economy by 78%. We've cut emissions by 44%. You're doing the same here in Austria, around the world. So let's do this together. And this issue about is Glasgow our last chance? Well, Glasgow has to be make, because the planet, unfortunately, cannot take a break.
Let me ask you one brief follow-up question, because clearly when it comes to incentivizing bold action, there is no tool more effective than the market. And apparently the pre-COP negotiations so far have run into some difficulties on what's called Article 6, which basically governs the use of market mechanisms, such as the carbon price. So how do you plan to get to yes on that one?
Well, there's a number of issues that obviously we need to resolve on the road to a COP. One of them is finance, and Arnold talked about the fact that we need the developed countries to step up and provide financing to support developing countries. You know, climate change doesn't respect borders. What's happening in one part of the world affects us all, so we need to support the developing economies. When it comes to Article 6, I agree. You know, this is something we've been talking about for 6 years. What we need now is compromise. We need to move away from countries just restating their position again and again. So I've asked 2 ministers. I've asked the minister from Singapore, Minister Fu. I've asked the Norwegian minister, Minister Rothvarten, to sit down and talk to countries and ministers individually. Let's see where we can find the compromise. because that is how we're going to make progress. And I want to arrive at Glasgow having done our homework. I'm hopeful, but there's a lot more to do.
We wish you the utmost success and steady nerves. Let me go now to President Levits. And we were just talking about carbon pricing. Latvia, in fact, has a carbon price, but let's admit it, it's pretty low. Alex Sharma and Jane Goodall have just reminded us we need to boost action. So how are you going to do that in terms of carbon pricing?
Yeah. Thank you. Let us remind that Latvia is one of the greenest countries in Europe. 40% of our energy production produced by renewable energy sources, and more than half of our territory are covered by forests. As an example for our action is that we doubled our carbon tax 2019, but it's not enough. We are working on the reform of a tax system in general, and in all kinds of taxes, or in several kinds of taxes, should also be included price for green gas emissions or pollution of environment in general. It's our goal, it's our action in order to achieve our goals 2030 and 2050. So I think that we are very active in this respect. But in general, I would say that Latvia is one, or belongs to the European countries which are pushing the environmental goals on European level and on national level. But I would say also on UN level. All three levels in Latvians are very active.
Coming back to the title, our overarching title of this year's summit, namely Healthier Planet, and what we heard from Jane Goodall, can you just say a very brief word about what you are doing in Latvia to address these interlinked crises of ecosystem deterioration?
Yes, we are developing different projects, and one of these projects is water, clean water. I would say that 3 billion of people are touched by the problem that that clean water is not accessible or not fully accessible to them. And Latvia is one of the 9 countries around Baltic Sea, but the Baltic Sea belongs to the most polluted seas in the world. And we have the capacity already developed to research and to develop different technical means and also policies in order to clean water. For example, in Baltic Sea, but it could be useful also around the world. Also, this is our mission, I would say, as a part of our goals 2030-2050. Because we have already this capacity, we will develop a legal environment in order to invite researchers and scientists from overall of the world come to Latvia and to search and to develop solutions. And then, of course, it's our contribution to achieve these goals.
Thank you very much. And I'll go right over here to President Ramkalawan. And Jane Goodall talked about the enormous challenges facing also poorer countries. And of course, Seychelles, you are already struggling literally to keep your heads above water. The pandemic, of course, has depleted your scarce financial resources. So what are you able to do at this point to mitigate the catastrophe that's lapping at your shores?
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're on the receiving end. And I'm basically making a plea to the developed countries, because all the expressions that we use as far as the environment is concerned, when we're talking of rise in sea level, when we're talking of coastal erosion, we're talking of what's happening to the corals, this is basically as a result of industrial development. And Seychelles, poor little Seychelles, with 100,000 people, with no great industrial development, when your glaciers melt, we suffer the consequences. We're an archipelago of 115 islands, and every day we see that our islands are slowly being eroded away. So we will soon not be an archipelago of 115 islands, but of very few islands. So basically, our plea is, help us. As far as the financing is concerned, when we're talking of rock armoring our beautiful beaches that lie at the center of our economy, without the beautiful beaches, Europeans would not be flying down to the Seychelles. The sea, sand, and sun concept would not be there. So basically, we're saying there's got to be justice. There's got to be one sister country helping others, organizations helping those that are taking the brunt of climate change, of the pollution. And I'll just give you an example. In 2019, my son was part of a team that did a cleanup of the Aldabra Atoll. Aldabra Atoll, which Seychelles has given to humanity. Within a couple of weeks, they collected over 26 tons of litter, pollution. And that was collected on some beaches that would not have seen a single human being in decades. So it's from elsewhere polluting little Seychelles. And what is Seychelles doing? We're small as far as the landmass is concerned, but our EEZ is 1.4 million square kilometers, making it bigger than Austria and even Switzerland. We've already committed 30% to conservation. Seychelles and Mauritius are now overseeing the joint management of Saya de Mala. And we have the largest seagrass bed there, which is larger than Switzerland. And you know the effects, and Jane just mentioned how the ocean plays a very important role. And again, we are protecting that for the world. Mm-hmm. So we are basically saying to the world, look at us, help us. This is the message that we want to send to the world. We are small, but we are playing our role, and we will continue to do so. The commitment is 100%, and the time to act is now.
President, one quick follow-up question, because, yeah, this is a message that you and other small island nations have delivered at one COP after the other, and we have repeatedly seen industrial countries failing to deliver on their pledges. They have caused almost all of the CO2 that's up there. You have caused pretty much none of it, and yet they have not delivered. Do you see signs right now that that's going to change? Very briefly.
Well, I'm just saying, please bring about the change. We're tired of seeing those huge figures, billions. We don't want just to see beautiful figures on paper, in statements. We want to see action. And I was very happy when President Bellen yesterday said, we have wasted 30 years. And I must say, Arnold, you're an inspiration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And along with weaning everybody off, getting that money flowing is clearly going to be one of the biggest challenges facing Alok Sharma, also Scotland as host of this year's UN Climate Conference. It is a very special honor to welcome First Minister Nicola Sturgeon joining us from Edinburgh. You have said the eyes of the world will be on Scotland, so we must seize the moment and show leadership in helping bring about real global change. So how can you support Mr. Sharma in ensuring that this COP really is make instead of break?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me with you this morning. And the President of the Seychelles has just very powerfully reminded us of the moral obligation that we all carry. All of us are very preoccupied with COVID, but the climate crisis, the interrelated threats of climate change, nature loss, pollution, remains the single biggest challenge that the world faces. COP undoubtedly represents our best chance, and I do think it is one of our last chances to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So Scotland is honoured that Glasgow will be the venue for COP, and we are working closely with ALOC and the UK government to make sure that it is successful. But that honour comes with a massive responsibility. Scotland is one of the birthplaces of the industrial age, so we are now determined to lead by example in the race to net zero. We've already halved our greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. We've got one of the most ambitious legislative frameworks anywhere in the world. We are determined we will reach net zero by 2045. We're restoring natural habitats, peatland and forests as part of these efforts. We'll shortly set out in more detail exactly how we will contribute to the global aims of the Paris Agreement. And we're trying to show leadership in another way, and it is about climate justice. If we're going to bring people with us in making the change we must make, we've got to show that those changes will bring benefits, ensure that people, communities and countries are not left behind. The transition to net zero must be just, and we have that written into law here in Scotland. We're thinking about it at home, how we make sure that we provide the skills and the support to ensure that no part of the country, no part of our population is left behind. But we also need to meet those obligations internationally. We work, for example, with communities in Malawi to train and lead a new generation of climate leaders. And we are determined that we will continue to support that through our Climate Justice Fund and in other ways. So we are determined not just to have the rhetoric here, but to follow that up with action. The final point I would make comes back to the first point about the pandemic. Over these last few months, we've shown what can be done when we face necessity. Things that we would have thought impossible have been possible because we had no alternative. We've got to bring that same leadership, determination and commitment now to the climate crisis. And so I pledge today that Scotland will do everything we can, not just to talk about what we need to do, but to show through action that we are prepared to lead by example. And I'm delighted to be here with you today to make that commitment, but also to share it with the others on the panel.
And First Minister, share with us one other point, if you would, because as you say, Scotland has possibly the most ambitious legal framework on the planet for reducing emissions. And Governor Schwarzenegger told the story a few minutes ago about talking to a political leader who said, but you know what, I don't want to move too fast. I don't want to lose the support of the lobbies, the fuel companies, the car manufacturers. The fact is, you took this bold action and you were reelected just a few weeks ago. So how do you do that? How do you get transformative policies put into place and still win voters' approval?
Well, the one thing I would say is that we set the target. We are halfway in Scotland to net zero. But getting the rest of the way will be much harder than getting to where we are right now. And setting the target is the easy bit. So judge me and my government on what we do over the next few years to meet that target. We've set out a climate change plan that goes into detail about the actions we will take, and that's what people should look to and judge us on, and I say that very openly and frankly. I believe, actually, and it goes to your point about being re-elected, I think right now, at this moment in time, certainly in my country, the people are ahead of the politicians, particularly young people, and they're telling us to go faster. For sure, the things we have to do over the next few years will have an impact on people's day-to-day lives in a way that, decarbonising electricity hasn't done, so it will get harder. But we have to be bold, and we have to be brave, and we have to be prepared to do all the things that we are talking about, because we owe that to not just generations to come. We certainly owe it to generations to come. We owe it to the generation right now growing up in our countries to leave the planet in better shape for them. So I believe that it is possible to do this. I think it takes bravery, but I think increasingly we will show that the political price that leaders will pay is not by being bold on climate action. It's about not being bold on climate action. And I think increasingly that's when leaders will be punished electorally, and that's how it should be.
Thank you so much, Minister. Stay. I'm going to come back to you at the end for just one brief word more, but I'm eager to go now to those younger voices you just mentioned. We've heard from leaders about their goals and their aims. I'd like to now come to an activist who has sparked a worldwide change in consciousness. She was with us here live at the Austrian World Summit 2 years ago. She had a very stark message for us then, saying, we've done enough traveling, we've done enough talking, it is time to act. Greta Thunberg, thank you so much for being with us once again. What's your message for us this year?
Thank you for having me. Tomorrow, 150 weeks will have passed since we started the school strike for the climate. And during this time, more and more people around the world have woken up to the climate and ecological crisis, putting more and more pressure on you, the people in power. Eventually, the public pressure was too much, and you had the world's eyes on you. So you started to act. Not acting as in taking climate action, but acting as in role-playing. Playing politics, playing with words, and playing with our future. Pretending to take responsibility, acting as saviors as you try to convince us that things are being taken care of. Meanwhile, the gap between your rhetorics and reality keeps growing wider and wider. And since the level of awareness is so low, you almost get away with it. But let's be clear. What you are doing is not about climate action or responding to an emergency. It never was. This is communication tactics dressed as politics, disguised as politics. You, especially leaders from high-income nations, are pretending to change and listen to the young people while you continue pretty much exactly like before. Pretending to take science seriously by saying science is back, while holding climate summits without even inviting one single climate scientist as speaker. Pretending to wage war against fossil fuels, while opening up brand new coal mines, oil fields and pipelines. You don't only continue business as usual as before, in many cases, you're even speeding up and scaling up the process. Pretending to have the most ambitious climate policies while granting new oil licenses, exploring future oil fields. Bragging about your so-called ambitious climate commitments, which, if you look holistically, are vastly insufficient, and then get caught not even trying to reach those targets. Pretending to care about nature and biodiversity while the world is cutting down a forest area the size of a football field every second. Pretending to be a climate leader while locking in a future common agricultural policy that will make the Paris Agreement impossible to reach. pretending that you will build back better after the pandemic, even though astronomical sums of money have already been locked in, and not in green projects, whatever green means. The G7, as an example, is spending billions more on fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure than on clean energy. This you compensate with beautiful words and promises that someone in the future will somehow undo your actions and make them net zero. And when your empty words are not enough, when the protests grow too loud, you respond by making the protests illegal. Of course, we welcome all efforts to safeguard future and present living conditions, and these distant net zero emissions targets could be a great start if they weren't full of gaps and loopholes, like leaving out emissions from imported goods, international aviation and shipping, as well as the burning of biomass, using baseline manipulation, excluding most feedback loops and tipping points, ignoring the crucial aspect of equity and historic emissions, as well as making these targets completely relying on fantasy-scale, currently barely existing negative emissions technologies. But as your acts continue, more and more of us are seeing through your manuscripts and your role-playing. The gap between your actions and words is becoming more impossible to ignore, while more and more extreme weather events are raging all around us. And as a result, young people all over this planet are no longer falling for your lies. You are distancing yourself further and further away from us and from reality. Some years ago, you could still claim that we're moving in the right direction. Today, that is no longer possible. 2021 is currently forecasted to be the year with the second highest emission rise ever. You say we need to move slowly to bring the public along. However, how do you honestly expect to bring the people along if you don't treat this crisis like a crisis? If it is one thing the pandemic has proven once and for all, it is that the climate and ecological emergencies have never once been treated as emergencies. The climate crisis is today, at best, being treated only as a business opportunity to create new green jobs, new green businesses and technologies. As the pandemic unfolded, you did not say, this will benefit the face mask manufacturing industry, or this will create new jobs in healthcare and hospitals. Taking bold climate action will naturally bring many advantages and benefits. Yet, needless to say, we will not be able to solve a crisis we do not treat as a crisis and that we do not understand the magnitude of. Perhaps playing a role helps you sleep at night, saying things just for the sake of it, because the words are in your scripts. But while you're busy working the stage, you seem to forget that the climate crisis is not something distant in the future. It is already taking so much from the most affected people in the most affected areas. This might just be a game to you, a game to win votes, popularity, points on the stock market, or your next high-paid position in a company or lobbying firm. The ones who focus on the packaging rather than on the actual content, and the ones with the most beautiful speeches and the most short-sighted, likable policies wins. You can and will, of course, choose to continue to play your parts, say your lines and wear your costumes. You can and will continue to pretend. But nature and physics will not fall for it. Nature and physics are not entertained nor distracted by your theater. The audience has grown weary. The show is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Greta Thunberg, for your very clear words. The movement that Greta Thunberg has helped set in motion has spurred civil society worldwide. Our next guest is an activist from the US who has become the inspirational voice for many young Americans. She's executive director of the Sunrise Movement, Varshini Parakh. Welcome, Varshini. Tell us your take on what we just heard from Greta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, Greta. I hope you're healthy and well. It's good to see you. And thank you for your extremely powerful and poignant words. I think you could have said everything I wanted to and better. And so I want to take this opportunity to really hone in on the responsibility of the United States at this moment. Hundreds of young people with Sunrise, including myself, were out protesting for hours in front of the White House this past Monday during a heat wave because the action taken by the United States does not go far enough. As the president of Seychelles mentioned, the US and other so-called developed nations shoulder historic responsibility for the emissions contributing to the climate crisis. We have immeasurable resources to support other nations to transition towards greener, more just economies. And I wish I had better news, but truthfully, the current plans for investments to stop the climate crisis fall extremely short of what we need and what must be done to be in solidarity with the global South. And so the current legislation the US is considering would invest 1/3 as much as Biden's campaign promises in trains, in public transportation, and electric vehicles. The clean energy investments in the current plans are 1/6 what was pledged on the campaign trail. The plan doesn't create the millions of climate jobs we know we need to do the work of averting climate catastrophe. And experts are saying if the current legislation on the table were passed, it may even take us backwards on climate and lock us into decades more of fossil fuel reliance. And currently the plan is being written and rubber stamped by ExxonMobil. 11 out of the 20 senators who are forming this new plan meet with ExxonMobil on a weekly basis. And so for the last 50 years, Exxon scientists and fossil fuel executives already knew that if we burned too much oil too fast, the planet could heat up dangerously. And for the last 50 years, they have been lying to billions of people around the world and attacking the science that we know is true. And now in this moment, Exxon is manipulating the negotiations and the legislation as a cover-up to strip clean energy investments out of the legislation. And so this isn't politics, it's pure science, and the evidence is in front of us that where we are right now is not enough. We just faced one of the worst heat waves in the Northwest and the West and in Canada, where hundreds of people died. The sidewalks are quite literally melting. People are being hospitalized, and this is climate change at 1 degree Celsius of warning. It is life and death at the most basic level, and we need the US government to act like it. And I believe we can do it. I believe that I have seen in American history the capacity to engage with some of the greatest existential threats in human history and mobilize economically and socially to solve these challenges, whether it's World War II or the Great Depression. But we desperately need the political will behind that level of mobilization. And I think grassroots pressure, like the way that Greta is doing it, like Sunrise and so many other millions of young people around the world, is one of the key ways to influence that political will.
Just the briefest of follow-up questions, if I may, on that point, because we keep hearing the U.S. is back in terms of the Biden administration and leadership from the top. But with U.S. politics as polarized as they are, it's impossible to say where we could be 2 to 4 years from now. But what about leadership from the grassroots level? Do you see a sea change going on there that makes you believe the U.S. is back no matter who is in the White House?
Absolutely. I mean, something has changed in the last 2 to 3 years, in the last decade, that can never be reversed. Millions of young people are waking up. There are teenagers who are leading this fight forward and who are committed, who know the science, who understand the politics, but more than anything, understand the desperate need to protect humanity, animals, our planet for future generations, and understand the threat that we are under, and in fact are taking responsibility for stewarding this planet in this moment. They aren't waiting for the adults in the room to take action.
Thank you very much for that message, Varshini Praksh. And let's give Varshini a warm round of applause. I have my eye on the time, and I'm going to ask just for the quickest of responses from Alok Sharma, and if possible also from Nicola Sturgeon, for both of you being responsible for this very, very crucial UN climate conference that's coming up. What do you take away from what you've just heard? Alok Sharma?
I think we've heard some really stark messages and another wake-up call. We have to act. And I talked about the G7. Some of the biggest emitters are in the G20 countries. They also need to step up as well. And we talked about urgency. We have shown collectively what you can do as humanity when you're faced with this pandemic. We have moved so fast. And I agree, we should be showing exactly the same urgency when it comes to climate change. We've got less than 10 years to get this right. We really can't afford to fail.
Nicola Sturgeon?
I take from what we've just heard is that actions count, not rhetoric. And people like me are not going to convince Greta or young people across the world through our words. We're only going to convince them through the things that we do. And that's the obligation I take very seriously. It's not a role, it's not a pretense, but it is action that will prove that. Our targets are really tough. One of the things Greta mentioned was the inclusion, or in most countries, targets the exclusion of aviation and shipping. These things are included in Scotland's targets. So we're trying to make sure that we're setting the goal and then being clear about how we meet that goal. But I'll end where I started. I could sit here and talk for hours. That's not going to convince anybody. We need to act. And that's the duty that people like me all across the world have, and it is one I'm determined to live up to.
Thank you very much, Nicola Sturgeon, for those last words to a very reflective and, I hope, energizing high-level panel. Many thanks to all of you for being with us here today.